Welcome to the Gridwise Architecture Council's presentation library. The following presentation by Don Hammerstrom on Transactive Energy Communication Standards Landscape was presented at the GWAC meeting on September 20th, 2023.
Thank you for the opportunity to present on Steve and my work recently on this report called Transactive Energy Communication Standards Landscape. This was, of course, done for the Department of Energy, and I thought I would start with the report citation so that you can look this up. And by the way, I have no problem sharing these slides. They have been approved by my organization, and I think I can get that done through Susie or Jamie, right?
Yeah, just email both of us and we'll share them with the group. Thanks, Don.
Okay, sounds good. So I did check, and this is on the government OSTI site, and you're welcome and encouraged to take a look at it. And of course, contact me or Steve if you have any questions. However, you will have to contact Steve by his Gmail account, which I don't think I wrote here, but he is no longer a staff member at PNNL, having recently retired. In fact, you see he's the principal author, but he is probably out fishing somewhere in Montana. So lucky Steve. The content of the report is basically like this. So these are the items that I will cover today. I have a lot of slides, but I'll probably go through them fairly quickly, still leaving time for discussion at the end. First of all, I think it's important that we talk about the context of transactive energy standards, because that does make it quite challenging in order to make an assessment of where we stand concerning the standards landscape. Talk a little bit about the methodology that we adopted, and finally get to the content, what is actually in the standards landscape for transactive energy, results in discussion, and of course, if time permits, I'll try to add some of what I feel are my own insights and opinions about this work and some of the observations that I made that might not even be in the report. And feel free to stop me, slow me down if you have questions on a specific slide.
I'll keep an eye on the chat for you, Don.
Thank you for doing that, Ron. First of all, the context. This is an attempt to create a summary of the standards, communication standards, and their status for transactive energy, but we're doing it at a time of rapid innovation. Of course, a lot of innovation occurred in the early 2000s and 2010s, but I'm not convinced that it's slowing down. It's just changing nature. And at the same time, while we have a common definition of transactive that I try to refer people to from this very organization, the GWAC, it's somewhat nebulous, and it's not currently helping people converge. So one of my observations is that I think people, even if they refer to that, have diverged from it, and other people who are doing very innovative things, especially in university settings, might not even recognize their work as being transactive because of the definition that we point to. A lot of flux. When we have some misunderstandings, I feel. I noticed these during the TE conferences where we tend to talk past one another because we're really talking about different concepts. So many of us, I feel, have diverged in our definitions of transactive energy, and while they might have derived from the GWAC definition, they've diverged quite a bit, so the discussions have become difficult. We also differ in our understandings of the applicability and uniqueness of transactive energy across grid domains. By applicability, I mean primarily, how far up into transmission generation does this go? Perhaps, while some people think of it as clearly a distribution type of tool. For uniqueness, I think some of us, I saw Kay on the list. Kay and I probably think of this as more of a fractal, self-similar type of process that could be similarly done at every location. Whereas I think many practitioners think of kind of unique applications across the domain, whether it's in transmission, distribution, or even at the device levels. There's a lot of confusion about grid services. I think we have to admit that, and how they can be applied using transactive energy. First of all, the grid services themselves, we're seeing a lot of discussion about that. However, transactive, if you look at the trail of a transactive signal all the way from somewhere up in the system down to individual DER or devices, the DER or devices don't even really need to know anything about grid services. So there's a lot of confusion about, where that intention stops and starts. And I think there are a lot of questions about what actually can be accomplished by TE. We have a lot of practitioners who are starting to look at voltage management, which is more of a control-based approach, whereas many of our approaches do not. I'll get into that more. I think I'm digging in too much here to get through the slides. Distributed versus centralized. Of course, there are centralized practices from which TE derives, like locational marginal pricing. But many of us think of this as very distributed decision making. I'm probably on the prior of that. Most of my tools that I'm developing are very distributed in nature for the decision making process. And finally, the market mechanisms themselves, the fundamental market mechanisms are tending to differ. So the things I'm talking about are auction-based, perhaps peer-to-peer types of mechanisms, centralized LMP types of mechanisms, and I've been investigating how to allocate some things that are typically in the fixed domain, like equipment types of costs. I'm missing the word for it, but how to include those in the more dynamic pricing and capital, for example. Thank you.
CapEx.
So in the midst of this kind of divergence and very rapid evolution, Steve and I tried to be inclusive so that we weren't, putting up any walls to participation. I'm very inviting of these things. I think a lot of great things are coming out of, especially the universities and university students at this point, that we probably should be more cognizant of, and we want to be inclusive of that. When given the opportunity, we tried to address the higher GWAC stack levels, the organizational informational types of levels, and ignore the basic connectivity, because those perhaps are not as unique to what we have to address for transactive energy, and those could be applied to any type of DR. And similarly, there are other places where, given the opportunity, we tried to, since the scope of smart grid itself is so large, we tried to focus in on those things that were unique to transactive energy. So the methodology itself, we really wrestled with this, but we came down to categorizations that are useful. I started with an interesting chart that would show the interoperability categories, namely GWAC stack categories, against smart grid domains like those that NIST and the SGIP came up with earlier in the 2000s, 2010s, and found that interesting. But I think Steve wisely suggested that needs to be broadened, because the GWAC stack itself and the domains do not really show the whole story of how we should choose and assess the status of transactive energy standards at this point. So he, working with Steve, we extended that, and he was more knowledgeable about some, admittedly, than I was at that point. So there are also these others, like interoperability cross-cutting issues, interoperability maturity levels, transactive interaction areas like those that are going into the standard interface work today. The new one that I'm sure, I think Farouk had presented to this group about the transactive energy concept model, he or someone else had. So that was one of the things that we wanted to bring in as one of the categorizations. And finally, actor domains. So what I've included in the next slides are just some pictorial representations that I think will help remind you what these categorizations are. So once again, these categorizations are the ways that we can look at the dimensions, let's say, that we can use to look at the status of transactive energy standards today, where we stand on that, the landscape. So of course you're familiar with the GWAC stack, and so you'll see two different sets of categorizations here. The interoperability categories themselves that start at technical basic connectivity and migrate upward into through the informational and organizational, ultimately ending up in business objectives and economic regulatory types of things. And then more recently, the cross-cutting issues. So you'll see these things. These are the types of processes that have to be in place regardless of the level of interoperability in the GWAC stack that you're talking about. Concerning a maturity model, I think this is also an interesting dimension, looking at the maturity of the standard itself. Has it just been proposed, or is it to the place where it's fully defined and ultimately being leading to a level of optimization? We could have also talked about these characteristics along the top, but we didn't emphasize that as much. And incidentally, this probably uses the DOE maturity model most, but we recognize that Carnegie Mellon also did some really interesting work on maturity models. This transactive interaction set of transactive interaction areas, namely these arrows right here, I believe have become the basis for a lot of the work that I see Steve and Jamie and others working on the energy systems interface work. So these are the types of handshakes, let's say, that have to take place between a transactive agent and either another transactive agent or something else in the transactive energy system. So this set is a valid and useful categorization of the status of transactive energy standards as well. The newest one to this set is the energy concept model that SEPA spearheaded. I had the opportunity to work with Farouk and others on this in this group. I thought I saw Rahul here as well on this process. You know, I'm not often engaged in these processes, but this was very interesting, and I think useful as well. We decided to represent the concepts on two planes, and because one of our desires in this report was to be unique to Transactive, then we focused on the transaction plane itself, which is this top one. So these are concepts that we determined through a consensus type of process were essential to almost all transactive energy systems, and they interact with the more physical types of objects and entities in the electricity distribution system. So I also extended this by just showing the arrows that go between these things going to some endpoint in this electricity distribution plane, but those were not as, the objects in the plane themselves were not as important as the objects in the transaction plane. I should add that this was a difficult consensus process. It's very difficult to come up with a common set of concepts that everyone would recognize belong to their ideals of what a transactive energy system is and involves. And finally, TE actor domains. This is one possible categorization, and I add that I think Steve came up with this, and I objected somewhat, but this is what we ran with. This has kind of a distribution system flavor to it, which I'm not willing to concede is the full nature of transactive energy systems. When I had started, I told you I initially looked at the GWAC stack versus the smart grid domains, and those are more traditional business types of domains like transmission, generation, distribution entities, customers, and so on. And this is perhaps not quite as large as that, but certainly valid. So given that, if we're going to use those many dimensions as our categorizations, let's see, in a sample to the, oh, shouldn't have done that. Okay, I made the mistake of trying to read a chat, and it threw me off. So in addition to looking at the let's say methodology by which we would categorize these standards, what's actually in the standards, and it's a very large set. Admittedly, the first one talks about the smart grid standards that were part of a lot of the NIST and SGIP group sets that came about 10 and more years ago. And that was just voluminous activity. My commendations to everyone who was involved in that, because it was a huge effort. But we also have TE specific supportive standards. We have organizations and committees of TE advocates, and we have perhaps even platforms and field demonstrations that have provided us insights. So these are the categorizations. My next couple slides are going to talk about more individual contents within these 4 categories of standards related transactive energy content. And let me just interject here. This was a hard process to start, because how closely do they have to adhere to transactive energy? Transactive energy is certainly a subset of smart grid. So if you look specifically for things that are transactive energy, you could perhaps be talking about a handful at most of types of standards. If you talk about things that are related or supportive of transactive energy, it could be almost an uncountable set. So we wrestled with that, admittedly. First of all, the overviews of smart grid standards landscape. You will recognize many of these. Time will not permit that I go into all of these, and I'm not nearly the expert on many of these that Steve is and was. But certainly all of those things are there in the SEPA catalog that was inherited from NIST and then SGIP, the NIST interoperability reference model, and all of the categorizations and cataloging of standards that NIST helped with in SGIP earlier, the 2030 model for smart grid interactions, smart grid standardizations roadmap of the IEC, and then the CENELEC ETSI smart grid standards framework. So these are kind of existing. Some of them have become somewhat aged, but they are existing categorizations that we necessarily are inheriting from. The things that are more TE specific and supportive include the OASIS suite, which is very specific to TE and turning out to be very useful. The 2 European standards groups for the FAN, or Flex Power Alliance Network, Universal Smart Energy Flexibility Foundation, or USEF. And most of us are familiar with OpenADR, and OpenADR 3.0, in my understanding, has been much more inclusive of price-based type of demand response. And of course, many of us who do field work know that utilities migrate quickly to OpenDR as a trusted standard. The IEEE 2030.5 Smart Energy Profile, from which a lot of the things like Zigbee evolved, and that seems to still be somewhat growing. And then new entry to this blockchain and energy, and which seems to be especially important for peer-to-peer types of interactions, and those of us who include those in our transactive energy perspectives. The organizations also are very broad and active. I'll let you read through these. The ones that I was not particularly familiar with included the Linux Foundation Energy, and of course I had to learn some about the European standards networks, including FAN and USEF. And finally, Steve and I had a lot of discussions about what we would include from things like platforms, field demonstrations, academic exercises, simulations, what have you, and the TE practices and insights that they brought to the table. And I have to admit they're important, and many of us have our favorites and, long history of experimentation and experience with these. But where do we draw the line? And especially how do we avoid introducing our own biases, which I was certainly trying not to do. So we kind of left that. At times we lobbied for including our own experiences in these things, and we're aware, of course, of European experiences as well, and ongoing ones nationwide. But we tended to avoid that just because it didn't seem to rise, for me, it didn't seem to rise to the level of standardization. However, it could be, in many cases, these could be blueprints for future standards work. So, as I said, I started out with this view of looking at the GWAC stack versus the smart grid actor domains and trying to fit those categories, those specific standards objects into that. And I was very hopeful at that point that that type of exercise would clearly show gaps where we should in the future fill in those types of standards for the purposes of transactive energy. Because of course, if there was a white space in that plane, then it would mean that we're perhaps missing something. That didn't really turn out to be as clear as I had hoped. In the end, I don't think the findings could be and were as crisp as I had hoped. First of all, the placement of standards, even if you get these planes to look at various categorizations and cuts or planes through the dimensions of good standards practices, then it's a somewhat subjective exercise. And even Steve and I would place things differently. And I choose not to argue on those right now. I think there's a lot more advantage right now to just this view of looking at the dimensionality and planes of the standards process and suggesting how we can further categorize it than stating exactly where these standards lie in these planes. So this, and of course, this problem blew up a little bit when we recognized that there were multiple categorizations, as were shown on that first page, in addition to things like the GWAC stack and the SGIP domain set. So these are just examples then. So, and I should point out that I'm showing 4 of these examples, but because there were so many categorizations, I counted that there could have been 15 shown. So at this point today, I think the concept's more important than the actual placement. This one happens to be one view or one categorization of actor domains, as was shown on a previous slide, against the GWAC stack levels. So you can see, I think Steve was actually a little generous toward the higher end, and I'll talk about that a little later since I let Steve fill these in. Mostly I didn't argue with him much on these, but I actually don't think there's a lot of extension into the higher level here. And of course, the extension left to right has to do with where it lies within the applicability for various actor domains. Each one of these is an alternative or a different cut. So this one is the interoperability maturity levels versus the TECM concepts, or at least some of those concepts. Not going to help with the assessment. I want you to at these points I'll go through these fairly quickly. Once again, I'll share these slides. So if you want to think about this more and look at these in the future, you may. Interoperability maturity versus interop cross-cutting issues. And finally, interoperability categories versus transactive interaction areas. Uh-oh, are the slides not advancing?
I see slide
No,
20.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it was my internet.
Okay,
You're good.
I'm on slide 20.
Yeah, that's right.
Yep. Good.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah, that's what we're
Good.
seeing.
That's what I see.
Uh-oh. All right. So slide 21, Jamie, if you're,
Yeah, I see them now.
so perhaps most important were the recommended activities for the TE community. So what should we do given, you know, this wasn't a thorough, voluminous, complete view of the transactive energy landscape, but it did provide some insights, I hope, about how to look at that challenge, and perhaps some more specific things about where the gaps might lie. The first thing is, and some of these are, I've interjected my opinion as well at this point. We should reconsider the definition of TE itself. And I already interjected some of my opinions on that. The GWAC definition of TE is pretty nebulous, and we have to kind of bend things in order to fit into that. And I'm not sure that it helps us converge on paths forward. So maybe we have to recognize that there are different categorizations that still fall under that definition, but help us understand the bifurcation, the differences in transactive energy, all of which are potentially valid. And we should strive to support all of such valid discovery mechanisms, new ones of which are even coming out of the universities today. So let's be inclusive and get those people re-engaged in this process. We should continue to look at and strengthen the SEPA transactive energy concept model. I admit that was not an easy exercise, so I'm not sure I'm sure that it's not perfect yet. I'm aware that the GWAC has further actions with that, perhaps trying to build build on that model. So that's a great activity. We probably should look at more detailed evaluations of the TE standards and profiles, and probably equally important is we should spend more time comparing the US international versions versus the European international versions, and see if we can come up with some commonality between those that will help us all move forward. And finally, we need to continue to develop open interfaces so that things like DER and customers can interact with transactive energy. So I think I have a couple minutes. That was probably at least 20 minutes. But my own opinion is that I didn't find a lot that really fit into the higher levels of the GWAC stack, the interoperability levels. And I began to even wonder, what does that mean? What do these higher levels really mean to a transactive energy system? And I'm less certain than I was when I began that exercise. In some ways, it seems that when you have business objectives, then you're really talking about an end-to-end view of the support of those objectives. And while I agree that not every entity needs to know every objective of its neighbor or upstream or downstream entities within the stream of communications, the exchange of value in the system, I think it is important that that there be some mechanism to enforce perhaps the attributes that are necessary. So an area where I think a lot is all of the electrical power related services, which include energy itself, power, and then the rate of power change. Those all could be important for, those are all things that transactive energy systems could respond to. But in order to respond to things like rate, there has to be a granularity in time, for example. And what is our mechanism to make sure that we have an end-to-end understanding of what it might mean for a utility, perhaps, that is trying to come up with the right rates of power change and what types of entities can and should be responding to those. I think that's probably what it means in these higher interoperability levels. And to end that out, I'm not sure that that can be completely supported by some of the handshake standards alone, like perhaps the standard energy interface, at least without a little bit more thought. And
Yeah.
finally, this was to look at communication standards primarily in the transactive energy realm. And there are other realms that I think are also eligible for standardization, and we perhaps are not spending as much time and energy on those. So we could also look at the standards landscape in the areas of device behavioral models, price discovery mechanisms themselves, and the valuation of grid objectives, which, in short could mean the pricing or valuation. How do we incentivize those grid objectives via a transactive energy system?
Thanks for the great presentation, Don. For more presentations like this, please see gridwiseac.org. Thank you.